Remember, folks, the main belief of the progressives was that society needed to be cleaned up and that the government should do the cleaning up, namely, that government needed to be an agency of human welfare. But the problem we know is that the institution that was supposed to be the agency of human welfare was itself dirty and corrupt. So government had to be cleaned up for the progressives to get done what they wanted to get done. Now, what we have to understand is much of the emphasis was actually on city government. And at the beginning of the Gilded Age, after the Civil War, the upper middle class and the wealthiest people in the cities said, we don't want to even be part of the city government. It has become so dirty and distasteful and vulgar that we're just going to sort of do our own thing and it's not really going to affect us. And potentially it could affect us positively and that we might be able to make some money, but we're not going to do anything to clean it up. And frankly, we're going to be rather indifferent. So what you see here is Boss Tweed. Everybody knew this was Boss Tweed, even though it's got a money bag for a head. William Marcy Boss Tweed began to dominate New York politics, namely Tammany Hall, the political machine that ran New York City politics back in the late 1850s. Now, what you see on the right side here is not actually Boss Tweed. It's actually the next boss after Boss Tweed. And of course, we see the octopus that from City Hall is controlling everything. And that was the feeling about these political machines, is that they were in it to make money, not necessarily to actually help govern the city. All right. So when you get to actually cleaning up city government, you have to pay attention to the fact that there are many people that didn't want city government cleaned up. So think about actually all the people that are connected to the machine. They don't want it cleaned up because they're making money hand over fist. It is thought that Boss Tweed actually sort of illegally gained upwards of $600-700 million in today's money from the graft and corruption, we say the skimming off the top, when his cronies were in charge. Now think about all the other people like saloon owners, brothel keepers, businessmen who basically had paid a bribe to the political machine to let them operate, sometimes illegally, sometimes semi-legally. And then think about all the urban workers who we've talked about, many of whom are recent immigrants who had gotten favors from the political machine. So it's a very interesting situation. You've got reformers basically saying clean up government, and you've got actually the poorest people in the cities who are really affected by what the city government is not doing to help them, saying no, don't clean it up, because at the end of the day we're still getting a turkey on Thanksgiving, or maybe I can help get somebody out of jail, or I can get a lead on a job. So in many ways, the immigrants themselves were conflicted because they lived in terrible conditions that were not being fixed by the city. Well, at the same time, they themselves did benefit in some ways. Now, one of the major ways that they cleaned up city government is basically by getting rid of the guy at the top. And what was, it's usually the mayor who makes all the decisions. But if the mayor is corrupt and taking bribes and all of that, you want someone else making the decision. So Galveston, Texas, way down on the Gulf of Mexico, came up with what was known as the city manager plan, where basically you hired an outside expert, somebody who understood urban planning, somebody who understood administration, who took control of the government. And the belief was if you actually basically had a hired employee, that person would remain untainted by all the corrupting influence of having to campaign and taking bribes and getting votes. But it is interesting because even though they brought in an expert to do it, in the long run, that actually had an unintended anti-democratic consequence. Because at least under the mayor system, voters had a say in who the leader was going to be, and they might get something as a result. But in this case, voters no longer really had a say in electing the true decision makers. So it was designed to clean up city government, but in the process actually took the power away from the voters, to the extent that voters had power, because in many ways they were puppets of the political machine to begin with. And one of the ways that voters had been puppets of the political machines had to do with the fact that there was no such thing really as a secret ballot. And so way back with the populists, they had said, we think the little guy will get a voice only when we can make our own choice. So what had happened before was that in the political machine times, essentially, political machine would fill out the ballot, would bring it to the voter, and would basically walk that printed ticket with the voter to the ballot box and would put it right in. So you could vote, but you voted on something that had been predetermined and you had no agency in deciding. So under what was known as the Australian secret ballot, because it was in Australia first, you got a printed ticket, okay, or a ballot from the government. It could only be filled out there and in secret. And the thinking was this would actually give the voice back to the people who no longer are just going to be pawns of political machines where you got a turkey on Thanksgiving, but you gave up your vote. So that's one way, giving the vote actually back to the people. Now, when it came to state government, there was this thinking that the state legislators, and remember, a state legislator is the politician. They work in the legislature, which is basically the institution, and they create legislation, which is the law. And so down in Springfield, for example, that's where obviously Illinois state government was. People looked at the folks who've been elected down there and they're like, you know what? They're not paid very well. They're not actually very educated. They're not very sophisticated. They're totally controlled by the party bosses, oftentimes up in the big cities. So even though they're down in Springfield, they're doing whatever the bidding is of the municipal leaders. So the thinking was, got to give the power back to the state voters. So how are you going to do that? Okay. The first is called the initiative. To initiate means to start. So the initiative allowed voters essentially to get enough signatures to put a new law actually on the ballot to be voted on. So let's say that, California famously always had all these new laws. But let's say they wanted medical marijuana, and the people in Sacramento who were elected there weren't doing anything about it. So if you got enough signatures, you could get it on the ballot. Didn't mean that it would get voted on by the people. It doesn't mean to be supported, but it got onto the ballot without actually the state lawmakers deciding that it would be on the ballot. So that's to initiate it, to get it started. Then you have what's known as the referendum. Think of referendum as it's referred back to the people. So, for example, like we see in California, if medical marijuana got enough signatures to get on the ballot, when it was in fact on the ballot and the voters could vote for it, it was known as a referendum, as in it was referred to the people. So it was initiated with the signatures, okay, bypassing the lawmakers, and then it was voted on by the people in the referendum, also bypassing legislators. In some cases, like in Illinois, we have referenda. You can't actually put something onto the ballot, but the lawmakers can decide it will be voted on by us. So in some cases, you might have one, if not the other. The direct primary was actually a way to give the voters the choice of which politicians would be actually representing each party. So we now know that under the direct primary system, when we went through it presidentially, we saw that there were, any number of Democratic candidates that Joe Biden ultimately became the nominee to run against Trump. Usually the incumbent doesn't really have to go through much of a primary process, but it's to make it so that the party bosses couldn't just decide, yeah, Joe Biden's going to be the guy. Okay. Although probably Bernie Sanders people and Elizabeth Warren's people probably thought that was how it happened. Now, the recall sounds pretty much what it is. Okay. It's where you can remove a public official before their time is up. So famously in California, Governor Gray Davis, gosh, it was probably 20 years ago, was recalled by the California voters. They had another election. That's when Arnold Schwarzenegger came in. Actually, right now, there's actually a recall effort to try to get rid of Gavin Newsom, who's the current California governor. All right. So California still has almost all of these progressive reforms. And then we have the 17th Amendment. That's the direct election of senators. And remember, prior to this, the House of Representatives was directly elected by the people. The Senate was elected by the state legislature. All right. And obviously, the Supreme Court was picked by the president and confirmed by the Senate. And the president himself was through Electoral College. So until the 17th Amendment came around, one third of the three branches was actually voted on by the people. But here, what it was trying to do is give the voice back to the people, take it away from the corrupt politicians and party bosses, and actually put it in their lap. Now, I'm going to have you analyze this particular cartoon, all right? And a boodler is a politician who's corrupt. And boodle is often known as the money that was given through bribes. So if you got bribes, which were boodle, then you were a boodler. Now, one of the main political reforms that had actually been going on even prior to the calls for cleaning up city and state government was women's suffrage. And I'm going to have you analyze this particular cartoon, which came right from the textbook, believe it or not. It's a great cartoon. So I'm going to have you look at the message and the audience. Now, in the late 1800s, to call for women to get the right to vote seemed to be a pretty radical demand, despite the fact that African American males had gotten the right to vote back in 1870 with the 15th Amendment. So you see right here this political cartoon that says a women's sphere, which was sort of the term, separate spheres, men have one sphere, women have the other, is wherever she makes it, okay? It's not the home. But what you have to understand here is that there were suffragettes who were pushing this agenda that said, listen, women should get the same rights as men because they are the same as men. And it was like, whoa, 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 whoa. Are you really proposing? It sounds like the Knights of Labor calling for equal pay for men and women. That seemed awfully radical because at the end of the day, it had pretty much been accepted that women have their role and men have their role. And women need to focus on being wives and mothers and the keepers of the home. And there are so many reasons that women shouldn't vote. And to propose that men and women are equal, oh my gosh, that's terrible. All right. That was, of course, the anti-suffrage sentiment that was coming out. Okay. So what you had was this reaction to it saying, no, 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 women should not vote. So you look at this cartoon right here or this image and it says, life is just one D thing after another. What is home without a suffragette? Well, it's basically saying this is what a home looks like. If your wife is a suffragette, you got to take care of the crying baby. You got to make the food. Oh my gosh, poor men. So the anti-suffragettes, who oftentimes were women themselves, I know that's interesting. So women were against women's voting because there were people that said this would in fact upset the whole natural order of civilization, going back forever to put men and women together like this, that suffrage would lead to divorce and that at the end of the day, women would create laws that would make it easier to get a divorce. And so the whole sort of married fabric of society would go down. Plus, we know that if women can now vote, then we're going to have them leaving their husbands and neglecting their children. Now, there were additional arguments that I don't have written down here. It was a very cynical idea that if women got involved in the dirtiness of politics, then they themselves will become dirty. Oh, because politics is dirty, women shouldn't be involved because they're pure. The other argument was, well, if you give women the right to vote, she's just going to vote like her husband because she does not have a mind of her own. So you're really just giving the husband 2 votes. Again, these were the anti-suffrage sentiments. So what happened was the women's suffrage movement said, okay, we're not going to be as radical. We're going to actually try to tone down our message to try to get what we want. And so the organization that you need to know is known as NASA, the National American Women's Suffrage Association. So I already talked to you about the WCTU, Women's Christian Temperance Union, which was, first involved in limiting alcohol, then trying to get involved in prohibition, sort of broader, getting rid of alcohol altogether. But they were very involved as a women's club that did focus on suffrage. Well, NASA was just all about suffrage. And the message tried to really be softened as opposed to sort of men and women are equal and that's why women should have the right to vote. So they claim that, listen, no. We're not actually pushing out of our sphere. In fact, if women can vote, they'll actually be really working from within their sphere because we know that women occupy a distinct place in society. We acknowledge that. Women, wives, housemakers. And in fact, we're very good at it. Think of this cult of domesticity, this championing elements of sort of what women have done forever. And so it's because of our natural perspective from the home that we can actually be most effective in politics. And what they argued was, listen, you guys have been trying to get temperance. Well, we can get it for you because it affects us. We know that it affects the home. It's a home issue. If you let us vote, will provide the necessary sort of muscle to get that across the finish line. And there was also an argument that said once women have the right to vote, war will not be on the table anymore because women are naturally more calming and pacific. And in fact, it is interesting that after the Great War, World War I, finally women do get a right to vote. So it may have been a bit of an acknowledgement that perhaps if women had been more involved in politics and in government, maybe we would have never gotten ourselves into World War I in the first place, although Germany certainly had a lot to do with that. Now, once we get to 1913, everything starts to change a little bit. You actually start to see more of a radicalization of the suffrage movement. So again, there's in the 1880s, 1890s, you see a radicalization. Beginning of the 1900s, you see a softening, but you're going to see a radicalization in 1913. Brought to you by Alice Paul. And I'm going to show you a video. It's about 5 minutes. I think Alice Paul is incredibly important to understand in terms of moving the suffrage movement into sort of a new space, a space that many British women had occupied and had been successful in getting women's suffrage in England prior to America. So you'll see right here, actually, a photograph of what you saw in the previous image right here, which was an illustration of let's go to Washington when Woodrow Wilson is inaugurated and really push for women's rights. Here it is. We demand an amendment to the Constitution of the United States enfranchising the women of this country. So again, this is 1913. It's not going to be anytime soon necessarily that we're actually going to see that 19th Amendment. So let's hear about Alice Stokes Paul.
Alice Stokes Paul dedicated her life to the notion of what she called ordinary equality. She came to the cause of women's suffrage when she saw Christabel Pankhurst heckled and forced off stage during a speech for women's right to vote. The Pankhursts' motto, "Deeds, not words," meant everything from speaking on street corners to participating in suffrage parades to throwing rocks and ultimately even to being arrested. The deeds were extreme, but ensured that the suffrage message was heard. Alice was sent to English prisons 3 times for her participation in the movement. While in prison, she went on hunger strike and had to endure painful forced feedings.
They usually tied me down by a sheet around the abdomen, by another around the lungs. One of the doctors stood behind and pulled my head back till it was parallel with the ground. He held it in this position by means of a towel drawn tightly around the throat. The other doctor put the tube down through the nostril. Then they poured the milk and liquid food into a funnel at the top of the tube. While the tube is going through the nasal passage, it is exceedingly painful.
Alice sailed home in January 1910. She introduced to the Pennsylvania suffrage movement bold new demonstration tactics, all from the Pankhurst playbook. Alice proved herself an innovative organizer and tactician in 1913 when she became chair of the Congressional Committee, a branch of the National American Women's Suffrage Association, or NAWSA. She traveled to Washington, D.C. to work for an amendment to the Constitution to give women the vote. Her counterpart in this work was Lucy Burns, a feisty young American lawyer whom she met in an English police station. In less than 3 months, the two organized a procession of over 8,000 men and women to march in Washington, D.C. in support of the women's vote. The procession attracted a huge crowd. As the marchers turned onto Pennsylvania Avenue, onlookers crowded the streets, preventing the parade from advancing. Hecklers tore at the marchers' banners and shouted at them to go home. Police did little to control the mounting chaos. The next morning, the parade and the riot, and more importantly, women's suffrage, were front-page news across the country. After several differences of opinion on tactics and strategy, Alice Paul and Lucy Burns left NAWSA and launched the National Woman's Party, or NWP. In 1916, President Wilson urged suffragists to stop their work in order to support America's war efforts in Europe. While many other women's organizations complied, Alice Paul refused, on the grounds that it was now more important than ever to have democracy at home before committing American lives to fight for democracy abroad. In January of 1917, the NWP launched a very bold new campaign to picket the White House. The Silent Sentinels, or Iron-Jawed Angels as one disgruntled senator called them, stood at the gates of the White House until November 1917, 6 days a week, 8 hours a day. In June, a group of young soldiers attacked the women for what they believed was unpatriotic behavior. Nearby police rushed in and arrested the women on the charge of obstructing traffic. Every day over the next several weeks, groups of picketers were arrested and sent to workhouses, jails, and mental asylums, all on the charge of obstructing traffic. Altogether, 168 suffragists went to jail between June and November of 1917. Imprisoned, the suffragists were fed rotten food, slept on hard stone floors, and endured filthy conditions. Alice joined the imprisoned suffragists in October, and soon after, she and the other women began a hunger strike. If any of the women died, it would lead to a political nightmare for the Wilson administration. Prison authorities initiated painful forced feedings 3 times a day. On the evening of November 14, 1917, a date suffragists called the Night of Terror, prison guards subjected incoming prisoners to violent beatings. News of the forced feedings and violence inflicted on the suffragists leaked out to newspapers and pressured the president to unconditionally release them. In January of 1918, President Wilson publicly announced his support of women's suffrage, and the House of Representatives immediately endorsed the women's suffrage amendment. It took several more months of open-air meetings, demonstrations, and forceful lobbying by the NWP to convince the Senate to pass the amendment. The 19th Amendment became law on August 26, 1920.
I never doubted that equal rights was the right direction. Most reforms, most problems are complicated, but to me, there is nothing complicated about ordinary equality.
So, what's really important to understand, and hopefully you got it in the video, is that Alice Paul had been part of NASA. And actually, what you saw in 1913 was, in fact, the procession that you saw the image of and the photograph of, and actually some images of during the video, was actually as part of NASA. But afterwards, Alice Paul basically was either kicked out or left NASA and formed a more radical National Women's Party, or NWP. And so, whereas in 1913, they had the procession on Washington, 4 years later, when Woodrow Wilson is inaugurated again, they basically start picketing in earnest. The Silent Sentinels, also known as Iron-Jawed Angels, picketed outside for 6 months. Now, what's really important is the United States entered World War I in 1917, and Woodrow Wilson said, "I'm doing this to make the world safe for democracy." Well, what was ironic was right here, you can see President Wilson is deceiving the world when he appears as the prophet of democracy. President Wilson has opposed those who demand democracy for this country. So the Silent Sentinels are saying he's a hypocrite. Think about it. He was fighting for democracy abroad, but he's actually not letting us exercise our democratic rights here. So Alice Paul was arrested for basically obstructing the peace outside of the White House and fasted for more than 3 days. Again, having learned these tactics back in England, the goal being, if we get really sick and should we even die, this would look really, really bad for the president. So maybe they're going to do what we want. This is our way to get leverage. Now, what's interesting here is that Teddy Roosevelt, when he ran as the Bull Moose Party, when he ran as a third party, he'd actually endorsed women's suffrage way back in the election in 1912. And then famously afterwards, when he lost in 1913, he said, "Conservative friends tell me the woman's duty is in the home. Certainly, so is a man's. The duty of a woman to the home isn't more than the man's." Okay? And so to the end, he says the average woman needs 15 minutes to vote. And I want to point out to the alarmists that she'll have 364 days, 23 hours, and 45 minutes. So it's not going to take away from her duty at home. So it was an interesting way of saying, like, listen, let her vote and it won't change very much. He also didn't seem to be pushing a real feminist agenda necessarily. But President Wilson in 1918, right before World War I is over, he says the task of the women lie at the very heart of the war. And I know how much stronger that heart will beat if you just do this thing and show our women that you trust them as much as you, in fact, and of necessity, depend upon them. So Woodrow Wilson had actually asked women's organizations, as you heard in the video, just stop agitating. Please, like, let's just all come together and focus on the war. Now, the National Women's Party absolutely did not do that. But in some ways, the 19th Amendment was seen as a bit of a thank you to women. Like, you really came through during the war. We'll talk much more about that when we get to World War I, but the work that women did when men had gone off to war. So it's seen as a bit of a debt of gratitude to women, as opposed to maybe just acknowledging that right that had been put forth for so long. Now, it's important to understand that while all of this is happening, it's not like women weren't voting. So if you go back to 1869 in Wyoming, it was the first territory to allow women to vote in that territory. And in fact, Wyoming was the first state in 1890. But what you'll notice here, from a Wyoming to a Colorado to a Utah to Idaho to Washington to California, all of these are Western states. Like, Kansas is sort of the first one. Yes, Wyoming is in the Great Plains, sort of the northern Great Plains, but it's really considered more Western in terms of its attitude, at least back then. The West had always been a place where women had much more power, in part because when women went out to these Western towns out on the prairie, they oftentimes were given, an opportunity to do a lot. There was a hard life. And so women were actually seen as much more powerful and actually had political power in the West. So when we think about suffrage actually moved west to east, unlike Manifest Destiny, which moves east to west. It moved backwards across the country. So Western states were allowing for women to vote before Washington, D.C., it actually, got the 19th Amendment. So you'll see that in 1918, it finally had gotten to the East Coast a bit, New York, and Michigan's not the East Coast, but it's sort of Midwest leans east a little bit. Now, Oklahoma is sort of southern, but then you get the 19th Amendment, okay? So the 19th Amendment is, I don't want to say sad, but it's a half of a century after the last time that you had a major voting amendment in 1870, which, again, was very important to get African-American males the right to vote. But for women to have to wait an entire half century is preposterous. But the 19th